But here's the question. Suppose somebody, here we were in a group of progressives, and I got almost all of you to say and think and do exactly the same thing at exactly the same time. When's the last time you remember that happening? Now, suppose somebody knew how to shape and activate networks like that in voters. Well, somebody does, and they're called the GOP. And I want to give you an example of that. Take a look at this word. It's the only time you'll see it in political discourse. It's up here today. Liberal. This used to be the word that defined the Democratic Party. It defined everything and everybody on the left. It was a word that was used liberally by the founders of this country. Thomas Jefferson called himself a liberal. George Washington called himself a liberal. The last time anyone has used this term to describe himself or herself running for president of the United States and won was that great liberal president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, 44 years ago. Why? Why is it that in my part of the country, the South, all you have to do to beat somebody in an election is say, my opponent's a liberal? That's it. Game, set, match. It's over. Why is that? It's because the conservative movement spent tens of billions of dollars and 30 years developing the essentially branding this concept and every other concept related to it on our side and on their side while we were fiddling with numbers while Rome burned. So what they were doing was they were busy figuring out how do we make people connect up liberal with all the things that are that they don't like. Well, how do they do it? Here's some examples. What do you associate with liberal? What does the average American associate? This group probably doesn't. In San Francisco, you may not. But liberal elite, those two words come together just like this. Big government, tax and spend liberals, cut and run, special interests. This one's a particularly interesting one. If you can manage to brand disenfranchised groups as special interests, you are talented. You're unethical, but you are talented. And just to finish out the rest of the network, we've got Volvo driving, sushi eating, latte drinking, godless atheists. This is what you have when you say a liberal outside the West Coast and the Northeast Coast and a few major metropolitan areas. This is what a liberal is, and this is why we're all progressives, by the way, because this term has been so contaminated that we simply can't use this term anymore. So, losing elections and issues, the secrets of our success. How is it that we have managed, ever since the New Deal coalition in the 1930s, registered Democrats have never been lower in the percentage than registered Republicans and have often been ahead, as they are now, in the double digits. Yet, in that time, we have only elected and re-elected one person to the presidency on the left, and that was Bill Clinton. It's a remarkable statistic, and the only Republican who has failed to win re-election was George H.W. Bush, who's starting to look like a really good president. A really bad father, but a really good president. So, how have we managed to pull this off? This, by the way, beats all the statistical odds. The best predictor of voting behavior is people's feelings towards their parties and the parties and their principles. We've managed to beat the odds over and over and over again. So how have we done it? Well, we can all recite the conservative catechism, even in this room right here, and that's what's frightening about it. And this is the Orwellian piece that Alex was referring to. When someone says, I'm running as a conservative, you can bet that what they are going to espouse is low taxes, small government, strong national defense, culture of life, family values, the idea that life begins at conception, protection of your right to own a gun. I just did this like this, and I'm a progressive. All right, so that's how well-formed those networks are and how they've essentially metastasized into all of our brains. That conservative infrastructure has just worked its way into our brains, and it's done this with the entire electorate, and that's even with those of us who are fighting it off actively with the best progressive chemo we can possibly find. Unfortunately, that chemo has been pretty weak. The progressive brand, where is that? Well, that's missing in action. You know, when we saw the Virginia Tech shootings, what was the response from elected leaders on the left? Nada. Absolutely nothing. On issue after issue after issue, Al Gore's position on guns and God bless Al Gore for switching from from his inconvenient campaign to an inconvenient truth, and starting to talk in ways that actually convince people and move people. I don't know about the rest of you. I've been turning off lights ever since I saw that in my house. Ever since I saw that, and I don't think there's been a more impactful movie, personally for my life that I've seen. But on issue after issue after issue, Democratic elected officials, in particular, who are supposed to be representing people on the left, have been essentially. Essentially silent. Al Gore, when he was asked about guns, said, "Well, I'm in one of the debates said, well, I'm for the registration of new handguns, but against the registration of old ones." And the principle is, I don't know, the old ones are rusty. I don't know what the principle would be. So how do you lose when, say, 80% of the people are behind you on an issue? Lessons from SCHIP. The first thing is, SCHIP, we managed to not be able to override a veto on that when the polls were showing 80% support for SCHIP. You want to know how to do that? Start by calling it SCHIP. There isn't a conservative in the United States who would use a term like SCHIP. What I say to elected officials all the time on our side is, do not take your acronyms out in public. And the reason you don't want to do that is because it's impossible to establish any kind of emotional power to go with an acronym unless you're an activist. The other thing is that most people don't know what SCHIP is. You don't want to start out with voters by making them feel stupid. That's not a really good idea. They're gonna tune out immediately, and they're gonna. The other thing is, if you think about SCHIP. It sounds like V-chip. It sounds like something you want to keep away from your kids. Think about what it's associated with. What are the networks that S-chip activates? For the average person, none. And the other things that it activates, sounds like, well, what's the big brouhaha about S-chip? Is it kind of like Pringles? There's too much oil in the chips? Or what is it? What is S-chip really? S-chip was simply one simple proposition. The people who work for a living ought to be able to take their kids to the doctor. Now imagine running on that instead of saying, my opponent opposes S-chip. Suppose you were saying, my opponent believes that even if you and your spouse are both working full-time jobs, if you can't afford health insurance for your kid, you shouldn't be able to take your kids to the doctor. You want to see how fast that veto would have gotten overridden? It would have been like this. But instead we were busy talking about S-chip. But it isn't just S-chip. It is everything on the left.